Hello friends, welcome to the first episode of Bone Daddy Stories. I'm your host and author Jason Bone Daddy Connor. While I'm normally found sitting around whittling out funny music, occasionally I get the urge to go to a darker place. These stories sneak into the darker corners of our minds, the corners we don't always want to acknowledge, the corners where the shadows and the boogeymen hide. These are short-form stories designed to engage your imagination for 10 or 15 minutes, break the monotony of your day, and make you wonder what really does go bump in the night. Sometimes dark, sometimes lighter, sometimes funny, but always engaging. This isn't Bone Daddy's normal lighthearted humor. This podcast explores the darker side of humanity that lies in the far reaches of everyone's imaginations. Since my young childhood, I have been a huge fan of the collected works of Stephen King. I credit him as inspiration for my love of scary stories. He's made me have many a sleepless night over the years. While I could never in my mind rise to the level of his storytelling prowess, I do enjoy creating these little snippets of terror and fantasy. Let's get one thing out of the way right up front. Yes, I use AI to create narrator voices to read my stories. I feel they give the stories a depth and emotion I couldn't achieve reading them myself. And, well, let's face it, I can't afford to hire a professional voice actor. So if that turns you off, you can go ahead and click off this podcast now, but if you decide to stick around, you'll be in for a treat. The story I'd like to kick this podcast off with is set in one of the places we have all been to. We are usually excited and full of loathing in equal measure when visiting the airport because going there brings a sense of excitement and adventure, but at the same time the stress of traveling is all too real. Checking bags, getting through the lines at security, worries about missed connections or cancellations, etc., etc. This story begins with businessman Arthur Vance running late to catch his flight. I hope you enjoy his tale.
Layover by Jason Connor, read by AI narrator Rufus Quen. The fluorescent lights of Greater Metro International didn't so much illuminate the terminal as they did bleach it. To Arthur Vance, they felt like needles pressing into his retinas, a steady, humming vibration that seemed to synchronize with the dull throb in his left temple. Arthur was a man of schedules. He was a regional sales manager for a mid-sized industrial fastener company, a man who lived by the Outlook calendar and the precise calibration of his Seiko chronograph. He didn't do late, but the traffic on I-95 had been a parking lot of steaming asphalt and road rage, and by the time he had heaved his Toomey carry-on through the sliding glass doors of Terminal B, he had exactly 22 minutes before the final boarding call for Flight 1422 to Chicago. Gate B12. That was all he needed. He looked up. A sign, backlit by a flickering tube that buzzed like a trapped wasp, pointed him toward the B concourse. Gates B1 to B20. Arthur started walking. His loafers clicked rhythmically on the polished terrazzo, a sound that felt lonely in the vast, echoing space. The airport was strangely quiet for a Tuesday afternoon. There were people, of course, blurred shapes of travelers in beige windbreakers and children clutching sticky iPads. But they moved with a strange, synchronized lethargy, like actors in a movie where the frame rate had been dropped. He walked for what felt like 5 minutes. The corridor was a long, sterile canyon of duty-free shops selling overpriced perfumes and oversized Toblerones. He passed a Hudson News, its racks of celebrity gossip magazines staring at him with vacant, airbrushed eyes. Then he saw the sign. Gates B11, B12, B13. Arthur felt a surge of relief that tasted like copper. He accelerated his pace, his breath coming a little quicker. But as he approached the gate area, he slowed. The sign didn't say B12. It said B13, and next to it was B14. He stopped, blinking. He looked back the way he had come. The corridor seemed longer now, the Hudson News a distant shimmering rectangle. He looked to his left. There was no B12. There was only a blank wall of brushed aluminum and a trash can overflowing with crumpled napkins and a single discarded boarding pass. "Excuse me?" Arthur called out to a woman standing nearby. She was wearing a gray cardigan and staring intensely at a departures board. She didn't turn. She didn't even flinch. "Excuse me, miss? Do you know where B12 is?" The woman turned then. Her face was a blur, as if someone had rubbed a thumb across a wet oil painting. She had no eyes, no nose, just a smudge of flesh where a face should be, though her voice was clear and dry, like dead leaves skittering across a driveway. "It's just around the corner, honey. Just keep following the signs." She turned back to the board. Arthur froze. He stared at the smudge of her face, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He backed away, his breath hitching. He didn't ask another question. He turned on his heel and began to walk, fast now, almost a trot. He found another sign. Gates B1 to B10. Right, he thought, his mind racing in a tight panic circle. I overshot it. I just need to go back the other way. He turned left and began to walk. The terrazzo transitioned into a thick, low-pile carpet of a nauseating shade of blue-gray, patterned with neon orange swirls that looked like radioactive cells under a microscope. The hum of the lights grew louder, a physical pressure against his eardrums. He passed a Cinnabon. The smell hit him, cloying synthetic cinnamon and burnt sugar. It was an aggressive smell, one that seemed to coat the back of his throat. He looked at the counter. There was a tray of rolls, perfectly spiraled and glistening with frosting, but there was no one behind the counter. No staff, no customers. Just the smell and the sound of a distant, echoing announcement over the PA system. Attention passengers for Flight 1422 to Chicago. Final boarding call for passenger Arthur Vance. Please proceed to gate B12 immediately. The voice was distorted, stretched out as if the speaker were screaming from the bottom of a well. "I'm coming!" Arthur yelled, his voice sounding thin and alien to his own ears. He began to run. He ignored the signs now, trusting his internal compass, his desperate need to be somewhere else. He sprinted past a row of vending machines that flickered in a rhythmic, heartbeat-like pulse. He ran past a closed Starbucks, its windows dark and reflecting a version of himself that looked haggard, the eyes sunken and dark. He rounded a corner and skidded to a halt. He was back at the Hudson News. He stopped, chest heaving, the sweat soaking through his white dress shirt. He looked at the magazine rack, the same cover he had seen before, a smiling woman with a headline about 10 ways to simplify your summer. But something was different. The magazine cover had changed. The woman was gone. In her place was a photo of a man in a slightly too small suit, looking stressed, holding a Toomey carry-on. It was him. Arthur recoiled, a cold spike of terror driving through his gut. He looked around. The terminal seemed to have shifted while he was staring at the magazine. The walls were closer now. The ceiling had lowered, the fluorescent tubes buzzing with a violent, angry intensity. He turned around to go back, but there was no corridor. There was only a wall of vending machines, thousands of them, rows upon rows of machines selling things that didn't make sense, bags of gray powder, bottles of clear liquid with no labels, and small, plastic-wrapped pieces of what looked like human skin. "This isn't happening," Arthur whispered. "I'm just stressed. I'm having a panic attack. Low blood sugar. That's it." He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. He tried to remember his childhood, the smell of his father's old Ford, the sound of the wind in the pines behind their house in rural Connecticut. He tried to anchor himself to something real. Click, click, click. He opened his eyes. He was standing in the middle of a wide-open concourse. The blue-gray carpet was gone, replaced by a sterile white tile that reflected the lights above like a frozen lake. There were signs everywhere now, hundreds of them hanging from the ceiling, sprouting from the walls, leaning against the pillars. They all said B12, some with arrows pointing left, some right, some straight ahead. Another sign read, "Not here, almost there, keep walking." Arthur started to laugh. It was a jagged, broken sound that echoed through the emptiness. He began to walk, not running this time, but strolling with a grim, hopeless curiosity. He followed a sign that said B12 for what felt like hours. The airport began to decay. The white tiles cracked, revealing a pulsing, organic darkness beneath. The walls began to peel, the paint curling back like dead skin to reveal rusted iron and weeping pipes. The smell of Cinnabon was replaced by something sharper, something metallic. The smell of an old hospital wing. He passed other people now. They weren't blurs anymore. They were fully formed, but they were wrong. A man in a business suit was walking in a tight circle, his eyes wide and milky, his mouth opening and closing in a silent scream. A woman sat on a plastic molded chair, her legs crossed, reading a newspaper that was nothing but blank sheets of white paper. Arthur tried to speak to them, to beg for help, but as he approached, they simply faded, dissolving into a gray mist that smelled of ozone and old dust. He was alone. He was the only thing that was solid in a world of dissolving geometry. He looked at his watch. The hands were spinning backward, whirling in a frantic blur. He didn't know if it had been hours or years. Time had become a suggestion, a discarded ticket stub. Then he heard it. A sound, a real sound. It wasn't the hum of the lights or the distorted PA system. It was the sound of voices, human voices, shouting, the frantic rhythmic thumping of chest compressions, the sharp metallic clatter of a medical kit being opened. Arthur felt a surge of electric hope. People, real people, help. He began to run toward the sound, his loafers slapping against the cracked tiles. He pushed through a set of double doors that groaned on their hinges, bursting into a wide open plaza. A crowd had gathered, a circle of people, real people, with faces and eyes and expressions of grief and panic. In the center of the circle, on the cold, hard floor of the terminal, a team of paramedics was working feverishly. There was a defibrillator, its whine rising in a terrifying crescendo. There were oxygen masks and IV bags. The air was thick with the smell of copper and desperation. Arthur pushed through the crowd. He didn't care that he was knocking people over. He just needed to get to the center. He needed to tell them he was lost. He needed to tell them he just wanted to go to Chicago. He broke through the inner circle and stopped. The man on the floor was wearing a gray suit, a slightly too small suit. He had a Toomey carry-on bag lying a few feet away. Its handle snapped. The man on the floor had a small, distinctive mole on his left cheek, just beside the jawline. He had a gold wedding band on his ring finger, the metal glinting under the harsh bleaching lights of the terminal. Arthur looked down at his own hand. The ring was there. He looked at the man's face. It was his own face, but the face on the floor was different. It was gray, the color of wet ash. The eyes were half open, rolled back into the head, staring at something that wasn't there. The mouth was slack, a small trail of foam clinging to the lip. Arthur felt a sudden, void-like emptiness open up in his chest. He reached out a hand to touch his own shoulder, but his fingers passed through the fabric of the suit like smoke. One of the paramedics, a burly man with a sweating forehead and a look of profound exhaustion, stepped back. He looked at his watch, then looked at his partner. He sighed, a sound of finality that echoed louder than any PA announcement. "Time of death, 4:14 p.m., the paramedic said. He lowered his head, the adrenaline leaving him in a visible slump. "There's nothing more we can do. We've lost him." The crowd began to disperse. The grief-stricken wails faded. The paramedics started to pack their gear, their movements clinical and bored. They were used to this. Heart attacks in Terminal B were just another part of the job. Arthur stood there, frozen. He looked up. High above him, a sign flickered. It was the only sign left in the plaza. Gate B12 with an arrow pointing to the right. He looked at the sign, and then he looked at his own dead body being loaded onto a gurney. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to walk. Not because he thought he would find his flight, and not because he thought there was an exit. He walked because there was nothing else to do. He turned and began to stroll back into the corridor. The blue-gray carpet was returning, the neon-orange swirls beginning to glow with a soft, inviting light. The smell of Cinnabon wafted through the air, cloying and eternal. He passed the Hudson News. He looked at the magazine rack. The cover now featured a photo of a man standing in a terminal, looking lost. The headline read, "The Eternal Layover, Why Some Travelers Never Leave?" Arthur smiled, a thin, ghostly thing. He adjusted his carry-on, though he could no longer feel the weight of it in his hand. He saw a sign. "Gates B1 to B20. I'm coming," he whispered to the humming lights. "I'm almost there." And then Arthur Vance began to walk.
Well, there you have it. The first story in our new podcast, Bone Daddy Stories. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please subscribe and share the podcast with friends, neighbors, relatives, enemies, heck, anyone who you think might enjoy a few minutes to divert their attention from the mundane world. But for now, this is Bone Daddy saying thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time we go exploring things that go bump in the night.